And what we'll do is whilst you're doing that, hopefully that will be starting to work, and then we'll give people a few minutes just to come in and then start. So for those who are just joining us now, we're just taking a few minutes to let everybody in. If you could make your way to Slido, which is either slido.com or slide.do. There's a code there to enter just to answer a couple of questions, and you can alternatively use the QR code off your phone. If it doesn't work, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter, you will still be able to participate. So just a couple more minutes just to let people in. Welcome to those who have just arrived. If you can make your way across to Slido and just let us know who you are or something about yourself, and that will give us an idea as to who we're talking to. Okay, so we've got about 20 people that have let us know so far. Got a wide range of knowledge and a fairly definite expectation that this is going to have an impact. So, so I think we're probably all in the right space here. I'm just going to give it one more minute to let people in, and then I'm going to start. We're up to about 37 people, I think. Rachel, would you mind just dropping the links into the chat so that people can fill them out afterwards as we go?
Okay.
That's 41. Great. Well, thank you all for attending, and it's great to see so many people are interested in this topic. We wanted to really just have a conversation about this. I'm going to give you a bit of background information about this topic and just link it into the clinical pathways and some issues that may need to be thought about. But really what we're interested in hearing is from you as to how the introduction of disease-modifying therapies will affect your clinical pathways, and what sort of things will need to be thought through carefully in order to be able to actually implement this. We think it will have quite a big impact, but we're not entirely sure if that impact is going to be soon, and I'll explain why, or whether it's going to be for the longer term, but I think at some point it is definitely going to be there. So it's great to see so many of you on the call. We've got about 79 people so far. It seems that they're a mixture of clinicians and non-clinicians, which is fantastic, and a wide variety of knowledge about this particular topic. I'm going to try and make it as accessible as possible. If I don't, please just ask any questions as to what's happening. So there'll be about 10-15 minutes or so in the beginning, just setting the scene, and after that we'll take questions, and there'll be plenty of chance for interaction at that point. By and large, if you could stay on mute, and then put your hands up if you've got a specific point to make, but actually I'm very happy to have the chat coming through as much as possible so that we can, we'll monitor that chat and bring those conversation topics through for more general discussion. So the basic summary here is that we're going to talk just a little bit about amyloid lowering and trial results and what amyloid really is. Link that into the dementia clinical pathway, talk about a particular therapy at the moment that may be approved in the next couple of months or may take longer, and then some issues related to the demand that may occur as a result of this, and a few broader issues that you may have. So so here we go with the DDR. Now this is a kind of a point just to make is that, you know, we often collect this data. At the moment we're all struggling with it, and the issue is often is why do we collect the information about dementia diagnosis rate? Well, I think this part of this session will help answer that, you know, emphatically. I guess the point to make for all those people that are responsible for this is that what we're going to be talking about is one thing that may well turn this entire spreadsheet green rather than red, and I think you'll see why as we go through. Right, so the story so far. So just a little bit about how this all works. So this graph is one that gets used quite a lot, and basically what it highlights is the fact that in the process of developing dementia, you move through a series of stages. The clinical stage is actually the last or very late in this whole process, but actually there are a whole lot of things that are happening within the brain long before that. And one of the first things is the deposition of a substance called amyloid. Now, amyloid is a protein that's in the brain, and for reasons that we won't go into today, it stops being removed at the same rate as it's being produced. And what ends up happening is that this then forms sheets, and those sheets have coalesced, and that in turn, in ways that again we don't quite understand in its entirety, damages tau, or damages the proteins that are in the long fibers that support nerves. And the truth is that we've known for a long time is that the deterioration in individuals is not necessarily directly related to amyloid being present. It definitely relates to the amount of tau that is abnormal and how much damage has happened to nerves. And there is a linkage through various mechanisms between amyloid and tau, and it is at many times it's quite difficult to be exactly clear as to what that linkage is and how strong it is. And that leads to some of the difficulties that we'll talk about in a moment. As you move through this point, you move to this yellow line in the middle, which is that you start to see changes on imaging, and only after a further period of time will you actually start to identify changes in individuals. And depending on the test that you do, it becomes easier or harder to do that. So, so if we go back a couple of years to about 2016, we've known that a number of compounds can take amyloid out of the brain. So if the theory is that amyloid is causing in some way the tau to become abnormal, then taking amyloid out should be a good thing. And what these graphs here show you is that not only can you do it, so if you look at the panel A, over time, depending on the amount of the substance, in this case, Aducanumab, depending on the amount that you get, the amount of amyloid removed is correlated. So in the top panel, you've got no difference over placebo, and in the bottom panel, the red that is representing the amyloid has reduced substantially. And you learn two things from this. One is that the amount of the amyloid removal is dependent typically on the dose of the compound that you give, but it's also dependent on the time that you give it for. And many of these are compounds that are given for a couple of years at a time. So the problem with all of this is that for many years, this just hasn't worked. It makes sense for it to possibly work because you are removing the amyloid. But in fact, when it comes down to it, trial after trial after trial just failed. And in 2018, it really looked like this was coming close to the end of the line for this particular way of trying to deal with Alzheimer's disease. So a range of different trials, most of them in affecting different parts of the pathway, but in this case, some of them affecting the amyloid itself, simply just didn't work, and so were discontinued. And in fact, Aducanumab, which is the subject of the discussion going forwards, was yet another one of those in 2019. It was another sort of major drug trial that just ended in failure. There was thought to be absolutely no benefit to the drug at all, despite quite a period of time on the drug. However, in between the time that one analysis was done and another analysis was done, and this is proving somewhat controversial, actually it became clear that although it looked as if this drug did not work, it might work. And here what you can see is that the first thing that was clear right from the very beginning is that the amyloid had decreased. So you can see, depending on the dose, the blue or the purple lines, this is telling you how much amyloid reduction there was. Now, we knew that this actually did work, even though the results weren't positive. But what then became apparent from subsequent analyses is that there was a clinical measure that actually made a difference. So most of these drug trials are absolutely dependent on having a clinical marker that shows a level of improvement. It's not good enough to simply take the biochemistry and prove an effect. You actually have to show that it has some implication that is meaningful to individuals. So here, what's typically used in most trials is called the CDR sum of boxes. It's a functional measure of ability, and it's usually measured over a period of time. And you have to get an endpoint on this for a drug trial to be accepted as being useful in clinical practice. So here what we saw is, despite the failure on the initial analysis, when two analyses were combined, what was shown was that with the higher dose of the aducanumab, in fact, there was a reduction in the change in the CDR. So less is better in this particular case. What you also saw is that this was an effect that actually was most prominent over the highest dose. So the theory essentially was that you needed to give enough, you needed to give the dose high enough, and you needed to give it for long enough, and that actually you may well see a benefit in terms not only of the amyloid being removed, but in terms of the clinical benefit that would be derived from this. Now, of course, this then led to headlines all over the place, as you might imagine. And, this is just one of probably hundreds that were around at the time. The problem with this is that when you mix and match bits of different trials together, you may actually just be picking the bits of it that worked and forgetting about the bits that didn't work. And there's a fairly involved process, as I'm sure, are all aware of actually authorizing a drug for use. And despite the way that this worked initially, where the drug was said not to work and then it was said to work, despite the controversy that engendered, actually this has been submitted to the FDA, and the FDA are considering whether or not to give it authorization for use. Now, they were supposed to report back in February, but have actually delayed that by a couple of months through to the 7th of June. And still controversy rages about this. Many people on that committee have been quite clear about the fact that they don't think that this is sufficient evidence yet for this drug to actually be authorized. On the other hand, there is a huge amount of pressure, as you can imagine, that no drug has been shown to be disease modifying up until this point that is available in clinical practice. And if there is even a relatively small chance of benefit, then there's pressure for this to move ahead. So from my perspective, I genuinely don't know how this will go. I think it could go either way. But here's why I think that this conversation is relevant, irrespective of what's decided on the 7th of June. So here what you see is the what's called the CSF, the spinal fluid p-tau and tau. So tau is this protein that is in nerves, and if amyloid is causing Alzheimer's disease and causing damage, then the tau levels go up because the nerves are being damaged. And p-tau is quite a specific marker of damage that relates to Alzheimer's disease. So irrespective of everything else, in several trials, and it's not just this one, what you see is that in the group that have been treated with these amyloid-lowering drugs, there is a reduction in the amount of p-tau. So something is happening in the nerves as a result of these drugs being given. And as I say, it's not just this trial, it's in several other trials, and it was one of the reasons why people persisted in the trials despite the failures. But my feeling is that because of this finding, amongst a couple of other biomarkers, the chance that a drug, if given in the right dose for long enough to the right group of people, is going to show an effect. So all of what we discuss subsequently is going to have some relevance. And if you look at this diagram here, what you see is the map of medications or drugs that are being trialed at the moment in different phases for Alzheimer's disease. There are some that are symptom modifying. There are some that are disease modifying. There are some that are amyloid removal agents, such as the one that is under discussion, Aducanumab. And there are another range of other drugs which don't necessarily remove amyloid but have different biological effects within pathways. So there's a huge amount of activity. And although much of the amyloid reducing activity shifted across to this right-hand inferior quadrant, I think some of it is shifting back again as people gear up for longer trials of higher doses and proving that the amyloid has been removed in the disease-modifying drugs. So that brings us on to clinical pathways, and this is where it starts to intersect with many of us. So if you think about this, what are we trying to do in our clinical pathways? What we're trying to do is we're trying to move from a very big at-risk population through to a much smaller population which has got varying levels of cognitive impairment. And it may start off as being subjective because there's a significant amount of anxiety about memory performance in quite a lot of the population, as well as those people that are actually being affected by a disease process. But you move through more objective levels of decline through to a sort of a named categorization of mild cognitive impairment where you are clearly not as capable as you used to, but you're still not necessarily going to progress. And then a category where the diagnosis is confirmed. And of course, you can do this at multiple levels. You can do it at the clinical level, and you can do it at the pathological level. If you blend that onto the assessment pathway, you start off with symptoms, and somebody will assess you. Now, I've put here GP, but often, of course, our pathways are more complex than that, and it may be other people in the system who are doing that original assessment. There may be other causes of the cognitive decline. People may be particularly badly affected by the dementia, all things that might take people out of the sort of pathway that I'm going to describe. But if you come to a specialist diagnostic service of any description and multiple people run these, you're going to have a few things done. Some things are automatic and some things are optional. So everybody will have a history and some form of cognitive assessment performed. The majority will go on and have imaging performed. And then in some centres, other tests will be done. So neuropsychology might be done. You might look at spinal fluid to look at the biomarkers to see if you can detect amyloid, or you might even do amyloid imaging that can detect amyloid on a scan. Depending on what you do and what your clinic profile looks like, you will have a varying spread of your results. You'll be able to tell a proportion of people that they don't have dementia and possibly find another explanation. You'll be able to tell a whole lot of people that they have dementia and that it is either Alzheimer's disease or a non-Alzheimer's disease dementia. And again, depending on the level of investigation that you do, you'll be able to classify this into mild cognitive impairment or one of the other categories. And you'll be able to work out potentially whether that's due to Alzheimer's disease or another form of cognitive impairment. Now, these are important because if we think about how a disease-modifying therapy might come through our systems, we need to look at what's the pathway and also how many people are likely to be involved in this. So if you take the population of England over the age of 50, it's thought about 2.5 million have symptoms of mild cognitive impairment, and about 1 million have, in addition to that, 1 million have symptoms of dementia for any reason. And then only a proportion of those will present to the healthcare system. So there are a number of drivers that influence that. And then again, a proportion of that will have a more strong or a stronger clinical suspicion of Alzheimer's etiology. And then below that, there will be a smaller proportion that have absolutely confirmed Alzheimer's diagnosis. Now, some of that will be influenced by the number of people you test. Some of it will be influenced by how severe people are. But what you're looking at is quite significant numbers. Here we're looking at 298,000 people, I think, that could potentially have amyloid pathology in the brain that might be responsive to a treatment that lowered amyloid. If you take the southeast region, what does that translate into in terms of figures? Well, there are about 9 million people, if my figures are correct, and you will have probably about 243 people who have MCI due to Alzheimer's per 100,000, and 286 people who have mild Alzheimer's disease per 100,000, which means that we could sort of more or less count on somewhere near 50,000 people. And if you take an average cost of delivery for the drug, or if you take the drug itself, which currently has a list price of about £26,000, plus you add the delivery costs, which I'll explain in a moment, you're looking at 1.2 billion for the administration, and you are needing to deliver this. Now, the drug is given by infusion, and it requires a certain amount of monitoring. In trials, you monitor every 4 months because one of the problems that can occur with this type of drug administration is that you can get areas of brain swelling that by and large are actually benign and self-settle, but the recommendation is usually to discontinue the therapy until they've done that and to follow people up. And it can certainly give them transient neurological disability, which would inevitably cause a fair degree of concern, both on the part of the clinician and the patient. So it's not an insignificant cost. And of course, this will be, there will be a reduction in the recurrent cost, but there will be a recurrent cost because people, of course, are moving through the system on a regular basis. So, so essentially what we have here is there is a fairly strong possibility of a disease-modifying treatment. The timing may be a bit uncertain. It would be absolutely necessary for anybody who is involved in this pathway to be making sure that people are selected based on the pathology. You have to have evidence that if you're going to give a drug that removes amyloid, that you actually have amyloid in the first place. And there are quite a lot of reasons, as you will appreciate from that pathway that I outlined, why it might not be amyloid that is causing the problem that you see in front of you. So I think that there are likely to be fairly major changes in clinical pathways. There'll be fairly major public interest in this, and there will definitely be a substantial cost associated with all of this as well. So, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to ask you what you think about this. Now, if you go across to Slido, and you get a chance for a moment to just say what you think. So you can do this either by using that code, the QR code, or go to sli.do or slido.com and put in 642894. And I think the link is also in your chat window. And if you want to go across there and just, it's a free text response. And the question here is what do you think will be the biggest issue with the introduction of disease-modifying therapies into clinical pathways for Alzheimer's disease? So I'm just going to give you a couple of moments to do that, and then we will start to discuss a few things. Right, so we've got quite a few things coming through here. 22 people have responded in various ways, which is great. And we'll start to bring that through into the conversation in a moment. So I'm going to start a general conversation. So, of course, it's always a question as to how we best handle this. So I'm happy for you to put any responses into the chat, but actually sometimes it's quite useful to have a discussion as well that's going on. So if you'd like to make a point, pop your hand up. I'll do my best to try and see you. In fact, that will be easier in some forms than others. Yeah. And I'm going to start to bring up a couple of questions. So let's just start right at the very beginning. So it seems that that there is a concern about the volume of patients. So I think that this is clearly going to be a major issue. How do you think this is going to manifest itself? What's the kind of mechanism that we're going to see? Is that because are people going to be pressuring memory clinics directly? Are they going to be pressurizing primary care? How would we potentially deal with this as an issue? And what are your thoughts? So I think here there's a comment. Even if the FDA approves it, it seems unlikely that NICE would approve it unless the evidence base was more robust and there was an appropriate cost-benefit relationship. So, so a health technology appraisal has been opened. I think it's reporting in 2022. The evidence may well not be sufficient for that. I think it will be interesting to see that if the FDA approved this particular drug, how that will play. What's the general feeling about how much public pressure there would be for this? Does anybody want to comment on that directly?
I think it'll be huge, won't it?
Yeah, yes.
And the pressures in primary care and secondary care, you know, the pressures will be on the GPs. The GPs refer to the memory services, and the memory services, the people will be saying, "Where's this drug? Give me this drug. I heard it's wonderful."
Yes. So, I mean, one of the difficulties is working out how you would manage that demand, because I think the general commentary here is that let's assume it does get approved. It is going to be a significant demand, and I think that even with some fairly strict guidance as to what it can be used for and what it can't be used for, that actually the pressure is going to be there because people won't know how they relate to the guidance. We've seen that in other disease-modifying therapies, in other chronic conditions. So what do you think will happen if people are coming to general practice? What's the inevitability about this? So I've got anybody want to comment? So I've got here huge pressure on all parts of the system, but particularly primary care. So if primary care refers directly into secondary care, what mechanisms can anybody suggest as to how you would manage that? How are you going to cope with the huge demand that will eventuate? Graham, you've got your hand up, so that's great.
Yeah, I think you would have a dedicated service. You'd have to separate other forms of dementia, wouldn't you? Because people with vascular dementia would be demanding the drug as well, wouldn't they? So I think you'd have to refer on perhaps from primary care or secondary care onto a specialised service, I think, and manage the lists that way. Because there's going to be huge waiting lists.
Yeah.
You know, probably catch up with skills. And
so what you're suggesting here is that this is going to require some dedicated activity. It's not something that is going to be easily absorbed in terms of the normal way that secondary care clinics run, or secondary memory services run?
Certainly in the short and medium term, I think, because you won't have enough qualified clinicians, I would have thought, to be able to en masse.
Okay. So Carolyn E.
Yeah, hi. I think that not just new people will be badgering their GPs, but there will be an influx of those who are already got a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or a mixed dementia, who may have been discharged from services but are already on donepezil, the cholinesterase inhibitors, or mantine, who will be wanting to come back into the system to be assessed for trying this drug. So I think the numbers are even bigger than just those sort of who haven't had memory assessments yet.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. What about people who are way ahead of the sort of Alzheimer's disease diagnosis, who have memory complaints, subjective memory complaints, the classic features that we ascribe to people that are worried but otherwise well? Do you think that's going to be a pressure too?
I think it's going to be a massive pressure. It's already, I think, working in the memory clinics, when you have people in the very early stages of memory issues, trying to decipher, is this something that we need to be worrying about? Isn't it? Is already a tricky situation, and if people are coming even earlier, I think that's going to be even harder, and it's going to be really about that access to the amyloid scanning, which frankly the vast majority of us really have very limited access to that, and that's going to be the only way to be able to make these diagnoses that early, in my view.
Yeah, so you've highlighted another issue here, which is the access to the diagnostics. So I think the difficulty here surely is that huge numbers of people are going to come through. They're going to have heard about this. Some will be appropriate and some will not be. But actually, you will have moved the pathway substantially so that more people will seek attention than normally would. And somehow you've got to disentangle that. So we know from Alzheimer's disease trials that even when you are assessing people with as much of the cognitive assessment as you can bring to bear on the situation, that you get it wrong at least 25% of the time, 20 to 25% of the time. So you really can't rely on clinical assessment. That's going to be a screening mechanism, but it isn't actually 100% fail-safe, as we all know from clinical practice. So I think the access to the imaging is really going to be or the access to the diagnostics is really going to be significant here. So I've got two questions really. One is, what's the general feeling across all of you as to how easy it is to access some of these more sophisticated technologies for diagnosis? So this would be CSF biomarkers looking for Alzheimer's disease proteins, or amyloid PET imaging, which it tends to be restricted to clinical trials. I would imagine that most of you have access to CT and MR scans when and if you need them. But let's see what we get in the chat here. So I think that there's not enough access. Yeah. Okay. So a couple of other issues coming up here. So I think it would be fair to say that there's not necessarily going to be sufficient access. So it will be necessary to expand the access to this. Just as a more general question, and it would be good if somebody wanted to just chip in as part of the conversation, is in memory clinics, so the tests would be either referring somebody for a scan, which would have to be available, or doing lumbar punctures to allow CSF to be taken to send off for CSF biomarkers. Do you think that there's much potential for doing that? The second one is doing CSF biomarkers in memory clinics, they obviously won't be a primary care issue. Brady.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, so obviously at the moment it's very difficult for psychiatric services to access CSF, and we rely on our neurology colleagues. But if we're going to be setting up services that we need to distinguish biomarkers, I think that's one of the areas that psychiatric services should be looking at now. And I see no reason that with support of commissioners we can't set up something like that. There's going to be a lot of work, and it's going to be for a set group of patients to start with. But I think that's the direction that old age psychiatry need to go into. And I don't want to get into a psychiatry neurology competition, but I think we'll be left behind as psychiatric services if we can't have access to things like that. You know, that these drugs will only be able to be prescribed by neurology. So we need to up our game.
Yeah. Alistair, do you want to come in, and then Paul?
Chris, thanks very much. It's a fascinating subject, and it's great to be part of it. I think, as a couple of people have said, this is a tremendous opportunity. This in our field is the first antidepressant. It's the first antibiotic. It's the first antipsychotic, and so with all the caveats that are being explained, this is something that's very important. I think, has been said, it's probably a different group of people, and some sort of regional network, I think, would probably be the way. I don't think memory clinics, as Brady has just said, would necessarily have immediate access to amyloid scans or amyloid in CSF. And I think probably mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's disease with a positive biomarker is the way forward. I think the final thing, Chris, the 7th of June is the latest that the FDA will say. It could come any day now. Nobody will know before it appears on the FDA website. But I think the issue is, even if it's not Aducanumab, it's likely, as you showed from the graph, Chris, that in the next 2 or 3 years, there will be something else. So preparing ourselves for a new way of working, I think, is key.
Thanks, Alistair. I agree completely, and I think there's plenty of opportunity here to do this, and I think it's an opportunity for different parts of the system to work together in ways that they haven't done. So neurologists to work with psychiatrists in ways that haven't always happened. Different skill sets are needed at different points, you know, either to get the CSF, or to infuse it, or to deal with side effects, or for that matter, unexpected findings on imaging that wouldn't normally have been done, which requires a fair amount of time and effort, I guess, to just resolve. Great. So I've got Paul and then Brady. Your hand's still up, but that may be legacy. Otherwise, just leave it up. So Paul French.
Hi, I'm sorry I'm a bit late, but coming back to lumbar punctures, I've only ever done one in my life, and I was quite nervous about doing it, to be honest. I've also got problems with my lower spine from playing rugby for quite a few years. I'm just wondering how many people you can do a lumbar puncture on in that group, and I'll be interested to hear what people think about the safety and practicality of that. And that would obviously put pressure on PET scans if that wasn't possible. Okay, the other thing is the logistics of doing that. It's where are you going to do it, where is the not only the capacity in terms of the skills that are needed, but the capacity in terms of the venues. My rural population don't want to travel, so that's going to be an issue. So I think there are a whole range of logistic and practical problems about delivering this. And I know they've been done before, but I'm very worried about the huge numbers of people that are going to be coming forward. I think that's going to put real pressure on my primary care colleagues. Pressure from people wanting tests where they hadn't come forward before. And I think it's going to be incredibly it's incredibly good news, but incredibly difficult to quite know how we're going to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that is coming out in these conversations is that clarity around who's potentially eligible is going to be crucial, and as much education and information out there as possible will make a difference. I don't think it will stop the flood of people wanting to at least find out about it, but I think the clearer we can make the criteria, the easier it will be to do some initial sorting. I think the difficulty is that even with that, there's still going to be quite a few people, And the difficulty comes when essentially if the only resolution you have as to whether somebody is eligible or not eligible is a lumbar puncture or a PET scan, that is quite resource intensive. Unfortunately, we don't yet have blood biomarkers that are fully reliable, but they may be enough to help us screen down that population. And the ideal would be clear criteria, a blood biomarker that tells us that people are more than less likely to have amyloid present, and then the ability to do the scan to be confirmatory, and then work out how we do the delivery. I think there's still a little bit in that middle section that's quite hard to sort out. So what about, so we've talked about a range of different things. How much training and education do you think is needed, and at what kind of levels of the pathway are we going to be needing? We've got a brilliant comment here about a traveling scanner and an LP unit. I think that seems like a good way to get around the capacity issues. Let me just read a couple more comments. Will there be a shortage of the medication as with the new vaccine? So I think dealing with that, I suspect there probably won't be that much of an access problem for the drug itself. It will be quite well reimbursed for the relevant pharmaceutical companies, so I think that they won't have too much difficulty with providing that. Let me just see if there's anything else there. Too many services discharge people with suspected mild cognitive impairment. There need to be services available for these. So I think this is another issue, is that we've in a way been lucky with the mild cognitive impairment diagnosis, because it allows us to say that something isn't right, but it doesn't have to, it makes us not have to be definitive about whether somebody's going to decline. But of course, if you give somebody a mild cognitive impairment diagnosis and there is a therapy, and you don't make certain that you're actually then including or excluding them from the therapy itself, I suspect that won't go down terribly well. I don't know what other people's thoughts are, but I think it makes the mild cognitive impairment category in a way more difficult, because you have pressure from that category in a way that you currently don't. Anybody want to comment on that?
I think you're right, Chris. I mean, certainly locally, 25% of our referrals turn out to be MCI. So if you're going to, or are diagnosed with MCI, and that's an interesting point, really. How do you define MCI? Because I know some of my consultant colleagues are very keen on that as a diagnosis and use it as part of their clinical practice. Others feel very uncomfortable with that. So you've actually got to standardise what is meant by MCI, I think, in order to make any sense of that at all. And then, of course, the numbers are going to be huge, and people are going to be coming forward with very mild symptoms. I know the pharma companies themselves are very keen to promote this as being done as early as possible. So if that gets out into the media, there's going to be lots and lots of people coming forward with very, very mild symptoms. Again, a blood biomarker would be very helpful, but it's huge.
I don't think it's in anybody's interest for this to fail if there's a rollout. I think actually making it a small target in the beginning to be able to roll it out is probably the wisest thing. You know, there'll be lots of pressure, but you've got to hold it back for long enough to be able to test the system and make sure that you're dealing with rollout adequately. If it all falls in an absolute heap, you will spend a long time recovering from it, I think. There was Jason, I think you put your hand up for a moment. I'm not sure if it's still a comment you wanted to make or if it was accidental.
Yeah, it was just talking about the MCI need. So within our mass service, if we make a diagnosis of MCI, we hold them for a year and reassess. So we were always concerned about discharging people into the system should they be declining. We weren't sure, but we also heard that the need of those patients is still there. For some people, a diagnosis of MCI was helpful. For other people, they felt like there was this cloud hanging over them, and they were just waiting for something to happen. So we've actually been starting to look at setting up a pathway with Dr. Dennis Chan to have a biomarker pathway for patients who want to move forward who are MCI, and it is about, are we talking the same language about MCI patients, who is most appropriate? But I think, you know, I feel like it's the right direction for services to start to build the relationships, and for commissioners to understand. And I think the way that the system has been shaping, there's always been that post-diagnostic support service and treatment, but now the system, I felt like, was starting to think about MCI, for our commissioners at least. And I think it is that journey to take them on now for services to start exploring it, so we're ready to do this. And I think there will be some patients who will be really keen to go forward for these extra tests, and there'll be ones who won't. And I think that will be an interesting relationship and conversation to have with them. That's definitely what we're seeing in our conversations, that some people are very happy to wait, others are very keen for more testing.
So I think this, yes, look, I think actually, and going back to what Alistair said about opportunities as well, I think this will help us be more sophisticated in our pathways. So I think we've been able to hold people in suspension by not necessarily committing one way or the other as to whether we think that they will deteriorate. Some of that's been due to the fact that we just simply haven't had the resources to be able to make that decision definitively. But I think if you've got a pathway that is now offering people treatment, you will be very, very definitely bringing them through to the earliest possible point that you can make the determination. That will require increased clinical involvement. It will require increased diagnostics. And then, of course, obviously, the delivery of any therapy. But I think it will also help those people that are not eligible. It will help with a degree of clarity for them. It will also define them as a non-Alzheimer's dementia quite often. It will remove the MCIs that aren't really likely to progress. So I think you'll get a whole lot of secondary benefits out of this because the pathway will be more sophisticated. So, you know, there are some knock-on benefits. There's a comment here about at what point in the pathway will this be most appropriate. So the expectation is that if it was going to be applied anywhere, it would be applied at an earlier stage. So that is mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's or early Alzheimer's. There isn't a discussion at the moment that's particularly advanced in pre-symptomatic treatment. So those people that have positive amyloid but don't have any symptoms at all. That is certainly a discussion point, but it's not what's being envisaged. And people that are significantly impaired, the benefit for them is likely to be less. And we know this from multiple trials, that if you wait too long, you aren't likely to benefit. Having said that, none of those trials in people that were significantly impaired went long enough and hard enough with the amyloid. So I guess, you know, there's an opening there too. But this would be mild cognitive impairment and or early Alzheimer's disease with amyloid being demonstrated. It would be, I think, if we went to the sort of system organization level. So I've often thought that you know, the amount of work that's been done on post-diagnostic support and organizing the rest of the system in order to get people to the right place has been extraordinary ever since we had the DDR, you know, over the last number of years. But how do we think we're going to be affecting the rest of the pathway, and how does cost come into all of this? You know, this is not cheap therapy, and whilst there may be all sorts of deals that are done in terms of how this is actually paid for, none of the drugs coming through would be necessarily much cheaper. Some of them might have different follow-up requirements. What do people think about this, and how do they think it might impact other parts of the system?
I think we'd need to understand what's the cost of not doing it as well.
Yeah.
The cost. What's the current cost of people deteriorating now without, or you know, the cost on the system at the moment for care, etc.
So that's a good offset, isn't it? So I think that there are a number of figures out in the health economic benefit of delaying presentation to nursing homes by a period of time, and this would certainly do that. So you're saying we could potentially offset the cost against the benefit of that. Good. Then there was it Katie Simpson that I saw had a hand up?
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Christopher. It actually fitted in very nicely with what you've just said, because obviously with diazepam, we've traditionally been told that, and sorry, I'm a clinical lead in Frimley CCG and a GP, but we've traditionally been told that diazepam and the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors buy people maybe 3 months away from a nursing home. So I wanted to sort of ask if you could put that into context for this particular class of drugs. What order of I know it's difficult, the data's unclear, but if you could hazard a guess, what sort of magnitude or sort of clinical improvement would you put on this in terms of, yeah, like you say, delay to nursing home care or kind of clinical improvement?
Yeah. So I think the the trial data is not yet showing huge effects, and what's not completely clear is whether you simply delay or whether you stop the process. I think we're probably likely to see, as we see in other things, we may slow it down. I'm not sure that it'll necessarily stop, but I think you would be looking in terms of buying a couple of years. I think that the measurable effects that you can see even in that particular sample suggest that you would retain function, and function is obviously clearly the issue at stake. So you'd retain function better than without the drug. So I think you would probably buy, in the order of 3, 4, 5 years potentially, but I could be just making that up. If anybody's got something more robust than that, please feel free to shout. But I think that's the order of magnitude that you're looking at.
Very helpful, thank you.
Right. So what else have we got? Are they? Yep. So there's a point here about side effects. So we talked very briefly about the nature of the side effects. This could certainly add some pressure to primary care, because people will be that will be what, and emergency services, because that'll be where people identified. I mean, this sort of change looks effectively like a relapse of multiple sclerosis or a TIA. That's the sort of thing. It'll be a transient neurological deficit, but it won't feel terribly transient at the time. And depending on where it is, it will manifest in a different way. So I think there's very definitely some knock-on effects of here. There's a comment here about offsetting costs being very important, but it depends on whether a system-wide approach is considered and whether that's saving costs for all or some of the pathway. I think that's right. I think often we look at our costs in isolation, don't we? And we don't look at all of the changes in other things like frailty pathways or the cost of care. And we certainly don't always consider the cost of informal care, which adds considerably to all of this. Right, just looking at time and comments, and in a moment I've got one more task for you, which is just to rank what you think are the most important issues, which we'll go to. But are there any other particular comments that people want to bring up? I think we've talked about most of these. We've talked about the access to diagnostics and biomarkers. We've talked about mild cognitive impairment. We're pretty much all of the opinion that there will be strong public pressure for here. We sort of, I guess, hinted about equity and access. We probably more access. We haven't really discussed how this may enhance problems with equity. The pathway we've discussed, and I think we highlighted training and resources would be needed, and we've talked about the cost. So I think we've covered a fair amount. Does anybody have any other comments that they want to highlight?
The only thing, Chris, was the cost of actually delivering the treatment. In other words, infusions cost money. Yeah. They take, what, 4 hours? I can't remember, 4 to 6 hours. Is that right?
It varies. I mean, we can often do it in 2. But you would need monthly infusions, plus 4 scans, plus some follow-up appointments, plus any adverse effects that would be involved.
And I calculated that in Dorset that might mean about 500 people in the first year, but 1,000 in the second year, as it were. And that's a huge number of infusions to find a time and place to do, really. Again, rural communities transporting it to have that done. I think that's going to be a cost that we need to consider as commissioners, because I work for Dorset CCG. I think we need to look at that. I understand that some of the other monoclonal antibody drugs, though, have a different delivery symptoms that might actually be less expensive to do and easier to do.
Yes,
So maybe there is some good news there, but I think we need to factor in the cost of delivering that and the logistics of delivering that when looking at the impact on the overall system.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the example that I calculated, it was about 100 million for the same time period that it would be 1.2 billion in acquisition cost. That's across 9 million people in the southeast. I think there are subcutaneous injections that can be given, and those can be self-administered, done at home. So there would be the potential for other drugs to do this in a slightly different way. I'm going to end this section on one of the comments that's just come through, which I think is just completely says everything. There are potentially so many benefits linked to this for people now and in the future. People with dementia have felt ignored for far too long, and this will give so much hope and release so much pressure on health and social care. Appreciate there's a lot to work through for this to happen. So I think that pretty much says it all. That the opportunity here is huge. The work to get it done is pretty significant as well. And what I'd like you all to do, if you wouldn't mind, is just going back to the Slido, which hopefully I can give you the link again. Go back to the Slido, and what you've been asked to do here is to just rank the items in terms of what you think is the most significant one, and then sort of from there down. Now, this is going to be completely subjective, we know, but it's just really helpful for us to know where we should be looking at focusing effort. So that's pretty much all we've got for you today. If you go across to that and do that, I mean, we'll hang around on the call, but you don't need to come back to the call afterwards. We will make a recording of this available. The slides will be available. I will make sure that I can leave all the slides in, and we will create a summary of this so that you've got that information, and hopefully it will be out in the next couple of weeks. And all that's really left to say is thank you all very much for attending. I hope it was useful to you, and look forward to seeing you on another webinar at some point in the not too distant future. So thanks for your participation and your time today.